We continue with our introduction to biblical archaeology. Another thing that biblical archaeology contributes is by telling us about everyday life and customs. It can show the kind of clothes people wore, the kind of diet that they ate, the size and style of their dwellings, their hairstyles for women, how they buried their dead, how they laid out their cities. And this can affect interpretation. Hairstyles, even in the New Testament, when it talks about head coverings, comes into play. We see on the picture that's here, Semitic tribesmen who came down to Egypt around 1873 BC in a inscription that's a wall painting at Beni Hassan, Egypt. And it tells you what Israelites look like, as opposed to here you have an Egyptian. He has somewhat darker complexion, and the others have their distinctive style of dress and mannerism. Biblical archaeology can help give us world history backdrop. We talked about the Hyksos in Egypt in terms of the book of Exodus. And that comes from archaeological data. It can tell us about the worldview of ancient peoples mentioned in the Bible. We can read mythological texts. For example, the Ugaritic literature tells us what a group of people that were somewhat related to the Canaanites believed about the god Baal. And the Babylonian literature tells us about Marduk, and there's other gods such as Dagon and Ashtaroth and various other gods and goddesses that we can learn more about by reading extra-biblical texts that mention these gods and goddesses and their mythologies. We have liver omens that give us insight into the magical practices of the day. And in New Testament times, you have at Hag Hammadi information about a heresy called Gnosticism that took place there. Here we have a portrayal of the goddess Ishtar in a 18th century BC inscription. By the way, in Mesopotamian art, you can always tell that someone is supposed to be a god if they have this little cap with the that looks like this. The gods always wear those. We've already seen how archaeology has helped us with the texts of the Bible, and thus helps in the area of textual criticism. We talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls, but any discovery of ancient texts, even more recent ones like the Aleppo Codex, would fall under the broad rubric of biblical archaeology. It's helped us with biblical philology. Back in 1929 and 30, they deciphered a language called Ugaritic, which has a script that's somewhat analogous to the Hebrew script. And some of the vocabulary in Ugaritic has helped us to understand some of the vocabulary in the Hebrew Bible better. Hebrew and Aramaic are both clarified by the study of related Semitic languages, not only Ugaritic, but also Akkadian. In the Akkadian language, there's a word for temple or palace, Hegal, which is known to be a loan word from an earlier language called Sumerian, Egal. But the Hebrew word for temple is Hekal, which is derived from that. And so in Sumerian, Egal means big house, which both palaces and temples were. We know that the patriarchs fit into the name formulation pattern of Amorites and Akkadians of the early 2nd millennium BC. And that also helps New Testament, Hellenistic papyri helps us to understand rare words in the New Testament. Not our course, I move on. Biblical archaeology can also be used in terms of apologetics. Now, archaeology cannot prove the Bible, certainly not the most important things we want to believe. Archaeology only gives us surviving remains, and the most important things we'd like to defend, the supernatural claims of the Bible, leaves no archaeological remains. But we can prove certain things. We can prove that Ur existed. We cannot prove, however, that God called Abraham from Ur to go to the land of Canaan. Now, Christians sometimes use archaeology to prove the Bible. More liberal scholars sometimes use archaeology to disprove the Bible. We'll talk more about that when we talk about the conquest of Jericho. But certainly archaeology can confirm some things. Certain persons, certain places, certain events that are described in the Bible did exist. And some of the events that are said to have happened are also said to have happened. For example, the besiegement of Jerusalem by Sennacherib, recorded in the Bible, is also recorded in his annals. Moreover, as we've seen, the texts of the Old Testament can be shown to have been reliably preserved based on texts that have been discovered archaeologically, especially the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, there's limits to archaeology. Only a small percentage of possible excavations that could be done have been done. Sometimes when you don't find evidence, it just means you haven't dug enough or haven't dug in the right place. At Gibeon, they excavated for 4 years before finding any evidence of occupation during the biblical period. Well, if they'd stopped excavating after 3 years, they might have concluded that it was unoccupied during the biblical period. But then they kept going and they found evidence. Some excavations have been poorly done. Back in the 19th century, archaeologists were little more than treasure hunters that raped sites and from the scientific view destroyed the evidence. Early 20th century archaeologists lacked good techniques for scientific excavation. And some things that have been excavated, the archaeologists die before they get around to publishing anything, and so they may have found some stuff that might be deemed relevant for something if only people knew about it. And there are problems with sites that make them difficult to interpret. There could be erosion. Sites could have been tampered by ancient construction projects like digging pits and the like. Certain materials don't preserve well. A lot of the writing was on a paper called papyrus. Well, papyrus does not survive. So a lot of the writings that we would like to be able to read or no longer exist because it was written on materials that do not survive. That's one advantage of clay tablets. They actually survive rather well. Of course, we have the same problem. A lot of our writing is on acid paper, paper that has acid in it, which is why certain cheap papers turn yellow very quickly over time. You might say that archaeology deals with the wrecks of time, and only things that can survive time survive. We call the Stone Age men, not because they didn't use more things than stone, but stones are the things that have survived from that period. Other problems: sites can be misidentified. Sites can even shift. There are 3 different sites called Jericho. Old Jericho, Hellenistic Jericho, and a third site, a Hellenistic Roman site, Jericho. And they were all called Jericho at different times, but and they're all relatively close to each other, but they're not the same site. Sites can be misidentified. Archaeologists once thought Lachish was at a site called Lachish. Has a similar name in Arabic, but that turned out to be wrong. And now we know that the correct site is Tel Ed Duwer. And we'll talk about Ai, as may have a problem of site identification too. And the ancient name of some sites is simply unknown. We have a mound, we know it was something, which name it had in biblical times is a matter of guessing. Archaeological interpretation involves a good deal of speculation and imaginative reconstruction, and that can easily go astray. It's hard to tell if a layer of archaeological site is Israelite or Canaanite. It's hard to know who or what burned a layer of burned the city down to cause a layer of charcoal. Was it a war, or did there just a big fire broke out and ravaged the city? There's two interpretations of a structure on Mount Ebal near Shechem. One archaeologist interpreted that rubble as the remains of the altar that Joshua built, according to Joshua chapter 8. Another archaeologist, it was Zertal, who suggested the connection with Joshua, but then another archaeologist, Kapinski, said, no, it's just a building. Doesn't have anything to do with an altar of Joshua. But then another scholar, Kogan, comes along and says, well, maybe it's an altar, but not an Israelite one. Maybe it's a Canaanite cultic site. And thus you get three different interpretations of the same data. Most archaeologists tend to hold to non-conservative, non-evangelical presuppositions that can affect their interpretation. Now, years ago, during the days of William F. Albright, he tended to take a high view of the Bible and its historicity, and that affected the way that he interpreted biblical sites. Whereas many Israeli archaeologists today reject the Bible and seek to interpret the strata on their own with no reference to the Bible, because on other grounds they think that the Bible is not reliable. Now, here are some of the major archaeological time periods. Old Stone Age, Middle Stone Age, you can see the dates there. New Stone Age, Chalcolithic, Early Bronze Age, Middle Bronze Age, Late Bronze Age. The Exodus took place during the Late Bronze Age. The Iron Age, which would be the time of the monarchy and after the exile. And then you come to the Hellenistic period, Roman period, and then into more modern times. Now, people speak about chronologies for archaeology. There's what's called relative chronology and absolute chronology. Relative chronology is this. Presumably, a layer on top is newer than a layer below it. And so you can get a relative chronology from that. But then in order to put years BC on it, you need some sort of external thing that you can date a strata to. That could be something like carbon-14 dating of some organic material that's found there, or a datable inscription, or they often do it with pottery styles that are similar to pottery found elsewhere. Basically, pottery typology is how they do the relative chronology. And so if you have a particular set of pottery types, then you know that dates to a particular time period. Because from site to site, you get a similar sequencing of pottery typologies from layer to layer. And so if at one site you have a pottery typology, and at another site you have a similar style, the style's changed over time, well then you know that would be relatively the same time period. But anyway, from time to time you do get some sort of datable inscription or whatnot, or carbon-14 thing, and from that you can date the whole pottery typology style. How do you do archaeology? You choose a site. You dig in little squares. This is developed by Kathleen Kenyon and a man named Wheeler. 5 meters square. And you dig down and you record everything that you find. That's the scientific way of doing it. It's a multidisciplinary thing where you have historians, biblicists, stratigraphers, and ceramic experts, geologists, geomorphologists, climatologists, zoologists. All kinds of scientific things can come into play in doing modern biblical archaeology. We'll continue this in the next lecture.